Well, good afternoon and welcome to St Paul's Cathedral and to this Sunday forum. Our speaker for today is Dr. Ruth Valerio. Ruth is the Global Advocacy and Influencing Director at Tearfund. I love that title, an influencing director, and an environmentalist, a theologian and a social activist. She has recently been appointed to the honorary position of Canon Theologian at Rochester Cathedral, where she'll be installed later this month. Ruth says that her particular interest in environmental issues means that she longs to see the culture of the church change so that caring for God's earth becomes an integral part of church life rather than an optional extra. Concerned to practice what she preaches, she has an allotment, runs a food cooperative, and runs a pig-keeping social enterprise with friends. We'd love to hear more about that, Ruth. Ruth's latest book, Saying Yes to Life, was commissioned by the Archbishop of Canterbury as his official Lent book for 2020, and Ruth is here to explore the themes of that book with us today. She'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions, and we'll finish promptly at 2 o'clock. A colleague from our shop will be here who will be selling her book at a discount, and Ruth has kindly said that she'll sign some copies for us as well. So would you please welcome Ruth Valerio.
Thank you. Wow, what an introduction. that was amazing. Wonderful to be here. I probably ought to say right at the start, in case I get questions about it later, the pig cooperative I'm not so involved with anymore, though would still happily tell you all about it and how it worked. Was involved in running that with a whole group of friends from my local church and wider, probably for about 10 years. And then actually as a family, as we moved away from a meat diet, we weren't eating the meat, so there wasn't much point keeping the pigs anymore. But that's been quite a feature of my life and of my family life for quite a while. But it's great to be here with you this morning, this afternoon. And I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you a little bit about my new book, Saying Yes to Life, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for this year. And I have to say, I was very, very surprised when the invitation came through for me to write this. I'd actually just finished a book called L is for Lifestyle, Christian Living That Doesn't Cost the Earth. I'd finished that in the summer, and that had come out, and I was really looking forward to 2019 and to having a year where I could get out into my garden, tend my vegetables, have a bit of space at the weekend. And then just before Christmas, before 2019, I got this email that threw everything up in the air, and my whole year was turned upside down, as it's not really the sort of invitation you say no to. So I knew I had to say yes, and then I had to work out how I was actually going to write this book whilst also holding down a very, very full-time and demanding role as a director with Tearfund. If you don't know about Tearfund is a Christian relief and development and advocacy organisation. We work in about 50 countries around the world. Our strapline is following Jesus where the need is greatest. And that's what we aim to do. So we work in some of the poorest, direst situations, the kind of countries that you would hear about regularly on the news: Syria, South Sudan, the DRC, and so on, and many others. And we work through the local church, and we work with the local church. So unless there's a disaster or an emergency situation, Tearfund will never go into a community and do something for the community. We always go in and partner with the local church, partner with dioceses, work to equip and help the local church respond to the poverty needs that are in their own midst as congregations and also in the communities around them. And through that way, we find that our poverty relief work is able to be long-term and sustainable. So if we go out, if we leave a place, it doesn't matter because the work is rooted in the local church and it continues. So I have a very full-time role overseeing a whole number of teams within Tear Fund and was faced with the challenge last year of producing this book, which clearly I did, much to my relief. And I want to take this time to explore with you some of the themes that come out from it. Themes around God, themes around this world, the wider creation, and themes around what it means to be human and our place as people within the wider natural world. As I do that, or one of the best ways to do that, is to go right back to the beginning, in the beginning. So if you are sitting comfortably, I'd like to tell you a story. In the beginning, words that are very familiar to many of us, I'm sure. In the beginning, before the heavens and the earth existed, lived a god and a goddess. Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the god of salt water. Before meadowlands or reed beds had been formed, when there were no other deities and no destinies had yet been decreed, these two, Apsu and Tiamat, mingled their waters, and from those waters came younger gods. Oh, this is sounding a bit different, not quite the in the beginning that you were expecting, is it? Those younger gods grew in strength and stature and became wise and mighty. Well, what a strange way to start an Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book. The story goes on to talk about all these gods and the young gods. The young gods become unruly and they fight and they rise up against their parents and they fight them, and Tiamat, the goddess, becomes this evil monster demon, and she rises up with an enemy faction. She creates this big enemy army with other gods and demons with names like the hairy hero and the scary scorpion. Can you believe it? If you thought Marvel and whatever had the say on all those incredible names, actually it goes back thousands of years, where DC and so on get their different comic character names from. So she creates this terrible army, and the gods are all asking themselves, how are we going to defeat Tiamat? How are we going to bring her down? Various gods volunteer to go and try and sort her out, but they daren't even go anywhere near her until finally the one god called Marduk says, I will go create an army for me. If I defeat her, then you have to crown me the king god above all gods. So they agree, and Marduk goes out. There's a hideous battle, and Tiamat is destroyed and killed in a really gruesome way. And out of her body, the world is created. So I start a Lent book with this strange story of gods and goddesses. Well, that story actually is the dominant creation narrative from the Mesopotamian era, from the Babylonians. And in saying yes to life, I wanted to explore Genesis chapter 1. The brief that I got from the Archbishop was that he wanted me to look at issues of environment and poverty, and for the book to be theologically rooted and global in scope. So that was my brief that I was sent off with. And as I thought about Lent, I didn't want to write an environment textbook or a poverty textbook. This needed to be a strongly faith-based Lent book. And Lent, as you will know, is in about 6 weeks, is divided in, it takes 6 weeks, covers 6 weeks. And so as I thought it through, I began developing the idea of basing the book on the 6 main days of creation, and having each chapter exploring the things that are created on that day, and exploring them both from a biblical perspective, but then also looking at how those themes work out in a contemporary way in our own lives, and from a global perspective as well. So that's what the book does. And in case you're sitting there thinking, does she not know that Genesis 1 talks about the world being created in 7 days? I do know that. And so day 7, what I have made into the conclusion. So the conclusion is day 7, and was a lovely way to lead towards Advent, Lent, leading into Easter, and the themes of the resurrection and Sabbath rest and so on. So chapter 7, day 7, is the conclusion that draws it all together. But Genesis 1 can sometimes be misread, and it can sometimes become a battleground for debates around evolution or creationism and science and religion and all of those big things. And as important as those questions are, actually that's not what Genesis 1 sets out to do. Genesis 1 is there, and the following chapters, is there to teach us some very clear truths about God, about this world that he's created, and about our role in it as human beings. And we only really understand those truths if we understand the context within which Genesis 1 is written. And it's likely that Genesis found its final form, those creation narratives found their final form when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon and were facing that situation of dislocation and being away from their homeland and questioning, who are we? How do we sing in this strange land? How do we sing to God? And the dominant narrative that they faced was this, it's called Enuma Elish. And Marduk, the god who eventually wins and is crowned king, he was the god of the Babylonians, and this text was one way by which the Babylonians asserted Marduk and asserted their own supremacy. And so we understand Genesis 1 if we understand this strange story that it's likely responding to. So what does it teach us? Firstly, about God. So in Enuma Elish, as I've already said, you have all these gods and a goddess all fighting against each other until finally there's one who comes through as the supreme ruler. What a contrast that is to the God of Genesis 1, where there are no other gods to fight against. God is the supreme, the mighty creator. He simply speaks, and it comes to be. He says the word, and there is light. He says the word, and water comes into existence. He speaks the word. As a psalm later on says, by your word, the world was formed. So we get this picture of a supreme, mighty God who doesn't need to fight against other gods. And this God is creator. He is the creator of this world. We'll come back to look at what that means about our view, how we view this world today. But God is the mighty creator. However you believe this world came into existence, the Christian and the Jewish scriptures affirm that God was the originator, that God is the source of all being. So God is a mighty creator. And we get this as well in Job 38 and 39, passages that you may well be very familiar with, as Job has been through intense suffering and he cries out to God, and he's had these friends who've been trying to be helpful in how they've talked to him and encouraged him or not. And God kind of thunders in, doesn't he, and really puts Job in his place. Where were you when I opened the storehouses of the whatever it is? I can't quote it off by heart. You know, where were you when I did this? Where were you when I set the winds in their place? When I, just this amazing just outpouring of God's might. And I wonder for some of us, depending on our church tradition, whether God has become too comfortable for us, and whether we may too easily forget the mightiness and the awesomeness of God and of who he is. And yet in Job 38 and 39, we also get a different picture of God. At the beginning of Job 39, it talks of how God looks at the doe giving birth to her fawn. He knows the doe. He asks Job, do you know how the doe gives birth? Do you know what her time is? Do you watch her? Do you see her bringing up her fawn? Do you see her as she crouches down and rears her offspring? And there's this beautiful intimacy there as well, that God isn't only a mighty God, God is also a close God, an intimate God. A God maybe who also crouches down as the doe crouches down. And maybe there are some of us here who need to know that God is there with us, that God is interested in the everyday stuff of our lives, that God isn't just a mighty creator God, or only a mighty creator God. He's also a loving, intimate God who knows us, who crouches down with us as we are involved in the everyday life of the stuff that we do every day. God is there with us. So we see this wonderful picture of God, and that's something that I explore in different ways through the chapters and the different days of creation. In one chapter, I look at the question, why does God create? Why did he create the world? And explore some of the thinking, particularly Eastern Orthodox thinking, around this creation being an overflowing of the love of the Trinity. I haven't got the time to go into it now. Just to give you a little taster of that, you'll have to read it. It's either chapter 2 or chapter 3. I can't remember which one now. So this question, who is God, runs throughout the narrative of saying yes to life. And then what about this world that he has created? What can we learn about that through Genesis 1? Well, in Enuma Elish, as I said, the world is made out of the defeated goddess Tiamat. So Marduk gets her body and he slices her, 2 slices, so slices her in 3. It's a very gruesome depiction in the actual text. And he divides her body into 3, and out of her body he creates the world. From the bottom part you've got the sea, and then the land, and then the air. And he creates the hills out of her breasts, and it goes into this, I think the rivers, the Euphrates comes from her crying eyes. It's a long description. So the world comes from this defeated goddess. And what's the impact of that? Well, the impact of that is that the world is seen as coming from something evil, and therefore the world isn't good. The world is something that you don't really want to be associated with. You don't want to be tainted with it because it's evil. It's something you want to escape from and not be a part of. What a contrast to what we see in Genesis 1, where right at the end in verse 31, we're told that God looks at all that he has made and he says, it is very good. My own personal translation of that is that God looks at all that he has made and he says, it is fantastic. This is wonderful. Look at what I've made. This is amazing. Such a contrast to the depiction of the world that the Israelites were kind of living in and fighting against. And so important for us to get hold of as well, because I think many of us may be from churches that have inherited a tradition that comes more from the Babylonian myth and from Greek dualism than it does from the Hebrew scriptures. Our Christian theology has often bought into an idea that this world is evil, that it's something we shouldn't be tainted with, it's something we want to escape from, it's not something that we want to be a part of. But Genesis 1:31 tells us that matter matters to God. God absolutely loves this world. And one of the things that I loved about writing this book is in each chapter, whether I'm looking at light or water, land and trees, birds, fish of the sea, etc. You can go through the different days. I do an exploration of, well, some scientific stuff. Part of what I wanted to do in the book is inspire in us a fresh love for this world that God has made. So there are some amazing facts and figures, incredible things about our galaxy, about the sun and the moon and the stars. Some wonderful things about light and about water, about trees and how they communicate with each other. But let me read out to you what is perhaps my favourite passage in the book. And this is in chapter 6, when I'm looking at day 6, let the land produce living creatures. And I talk about the phrase that all the creatures were made, that it was teeming with life. In other words, we share this world with the most incredible and wonderful mix of strange, colourful, funny, scary, cuddly, scaly, odd, tiny, huge creatures that we could ever possibly imagine. Who could have thought up the star-shaped mole of North America with its 22 little tentacles on the end of its nose that it uses to find food? Or the tiny elusive primate called the tarsier of Southeast Asia, with its huge eyes, ability to turn its head 180 degrees, and super long back legs which enable it to leap up to 5 meters from branch to branch? Who would make up the Saiga antelope of Eurasia, with its strange nose that comes down over its mouth? Or the aardvark of sub-Saharan Africa, with its long tongue and kangaroo-like ears? Or the lion-tailed macaque of India, with its stunning silver-white mane and tail that ends in a tuft like a lion's? Who would think to put such tufty ears on the European lynx? And whoever could have imagined the duck-billed platypus with its duck-like bill and beaver-like tail? Wherever in the world we live, in the city or in the countryside, we have amazing creatures around us, even if they're not all as fancy as those just mentioned. And I go on to say, why not pause for a moment to think about the animals that live around you and give thanks to God for such an abundance of life? So we live in a wonderful world. And yet we know that we live in a wounded world. We live in a world that is suffering the terrible consequences of, well, the biblical language would be our sin, our wrongdoing, our misuse, the wrong way by which we have lived in this world. And each chapter, whether I'm looking at water or light or trees or living creatures, whatever it is, I explore also the challenges that we're facing in our world around these things. So chapter 2 that looks at the separation of the waters, I look at water today and think about issues of drought and of flooding, of sanitation and health, the lack of access to clean water. We are living in a wounded world, aren't we? And there are 3 issues in particular that we need to take notice of and be acting on. The first, I'm sure I don't need to say, of course, is our climate crisis. I could give many a long lecture on this, so I won't. I know we all know that we are facing a climate crisis of unprecedented levels. And I've been speaking on issues of climate and writing on them probably for about 25 years now. And it's, I realised with a sickening thud the other day that all of the things that I used to talk about as predictions, you know, this is what's happening. If we don't take action now, this is what is going to happen in the future. All of those things that were predictions, we are seeing now. This year seems to be, or last year, seems to be a coming together of so many problems, extreme weather events, the bleaching of the coral reef, crops dying. I mean, I could go on, couldn't I? And it feels like we have reached this particularly heightened moment with climate change. And in my work at Tear Fund, well, as Tear Fund, we've been talking about this as an organisation for about 20 years, because even all those years ago, we were beginning to get reports from the communities that we worked into that something strange was happening. The rains weren't coming, the crops weren't growing. When the rains did come, they came late, and then they came so strong that then there was flooding that washed away all the food, and there was starvation and there was disease. But we see it increasingly, and so as Tear Fund now, a lot of our work is focused on the climate crisis, both trying to advocate to governments and to global institutions to be changing their practices, advocating, encouraging individuals to be living differently, and then working with the communities that we work with around things like climate smart agriculture and renewable energy and so on. Some of these things that will help the communities face our climate crisis. So we are facing a climate crisis. We are also facing terrible biodiversity loss. And that wonderful passage that I just read out, you know, we have lived in this beautiful world teeming with life, but that teeming is collapsing. We used to experience flocks. Are they called flocks of butterflies? What are they called? Lots of butterflies, swarm, what are they called? Lots of butterflies. And now we get excited if we see one peacock butterfly or one red admiral or something in our garden. This isn't only about the polar bear, though that of course is extremely serious, but right around the world and closer to home, we are seeing species disappearing around us. The hedgehog being maybe one of our most loved mammals, having suffered a 99% decline, and now in the UK on the extinction list. So we're facing biodiversity loss, terrible biodiversity. And how much is behind those sanitized words, biodiversity loss? Actually, this is millions of creatures dying and species that God loves going extinct. And then thirdly, we're facing a plastic problem, aren't we? And we are drowning in plastic. This has become so well highlighted to us over the last few years, but it's having a big impact. It's having a massive impact on the seas with marine plastic pollution, and we're all familiar with the pictures of the albatross chick and the whale and so on, and the turtle. It's also having an impact on us, and there's increasing research now showing that we may actually be breathing in plastic all the time because it's so pervasive, it's in the air, particularly in our cities. And we know that we are now ingesting it because it is so embedded into our food chain. What we don't know is what the long-term impacts of that are going to be on our health. And then plastic is also causing serious problems for people living in poverty. Around 2 billion people in our world today don't have proper access to waste management systems. And therefore they are living in communities where plastic and rubbish is just piled high. And it's causing big problems to their health. There's an increase in diarrheal diseases. There's an increase in malaria because the upturned pots gather water and create perfect little breeding grounds for mosquitoes. It can lead to death when rivers are so choked with plastic that when there are heavy rains, that then there's big flooding. This is an area that we're focusing on a lot as Tear Fund, the impact of plastic on people living in poverty. That's too many P's for one sentence. And one of the areas we're working in is a slum area in Brazil, and we're supporting the work of a local Baptist church that's engaged in a whole load of recycling and reusing and women's cooperative work there. And it was started because one woman living in the slum, after some heavy rains that flooded the river because of all the plastic, all the waste that was there, she looked out of her window and she saw the dead body of her neighbour float past from the floods. And when she saw that, she knew that they couldn't live in the way they were living anymore, and they had to start dealing with plastic. And so this is something that we work on as Tear Fund, working with communities on the ground. And then we're also running a campaign called the Rubbish Campaign, focusing on Coca-Cola, Unilever, Nestle and PepsiCo. They are the 4 biggest consumer-facing plastic producers, calling on them to change their practices. And you can find any of this online if you want to find more information about it. So we live in a wounded world, and Archbishop Winston Halapua, who was the former Archbishop of Polynesia, he tells of how when something of importance in the Pacific Islands needs to be signalled, they blow a conch horn. And he wrote a letter for creation to the Archbishop, and in it he says, "We need to blow a conch to alert the world of danger, not only to ourselves, but to the whole planet Earth. We need to call for a working together to care for our common home. We need to raise prophetic voices today. We face great crises and need to face them together. We have the opportunity to forward a new movement of caring more deeply for God's creation, of celebrating its wonders, and of discovering our common humanity." And this book, along with many other things, my aim is to blow that conch horn and alert us to the dangers that we are facing. But not just alert us to the dangers, then actually help us find some answers and take action in our own lives and in the lives of our churches, for those of us here who are from churches. And so each chapter, alongside the biblical faith reflection on what was created on that day, alongside the scientific things exploring the wonders of the natural world, and then alongside the contemporary issues that we face, then looks at what can we do? What can we do about water, our water problems? What can we do about deforestation? What can we do about our marine problem? About species extinction, about our climate crisis. And so each chapter has very practical suggestions as well. It's a book that's there not only to be interesting, but to give you some answers and to inform you and equip you and help you and your church, if that's applicable, to make some changes and to take some positive action. And it also draws on lots of examples from churches all around the world who are already engaged and are taking action. So let me just read out to you one paragraph that comes from the conclusion. Where shall I start? So I see churches all around the world responding to the call to look after the planet that's been entrusted to us. In Thailand, Hue Mei Due Church is now involved in garbage collection because waste had become a huge problem in the area. And Kumu Church has planted a vegetable garden for the local community. In Australia, Tugaronong Uniting runs a charity shop to encourage reusing and recycling, and they have activists who belong to climate change groups. In the US, Trinity Christian Reformed Church in Michigan promotes caring for the whole creation as an integral part of its preaching. And practically, it's adopted a stretch of creek that runs near the church that it looks after. In Argentina, the Church of God in Mendoza has won an award for its litter picking scheme in the Central Park. And the Anglican Diocese of Northern Argentina has been monitoring deforestation for the last decade, providing information to the provincial government in order to help the government stop deforestation. In the UK, Portsmouth Cathedral has become the first cathedral to publish its carbon footprint and is actively reducing its emissions. And the Gate Church in Dundee has a whole project dedicated to carbon saving and is aiming to become the greenest church in Scotland. And even here in St Paul's has at least a bronze, I can't remember whether it's silver or not, but it has a bronze Eco-Church award for the work that it does here around sustainability, which I don't know if I dare offer you, if you would like me to offer you to answer any questions on that, because you might not know yourself. But if you want to find out more, I'm sure there are ways that you can. And the Eco-Church scheme was actually launched here 4 years ago, just in the crypt out there and to the right. So St Paul's here is also involved in doing things to take care of this world. There are churches all around the world who are getting engaged, but we need to see that more. We need systemic change. I sometimes liken the church to being like a giant, a sleeping giant. And if we could wake that giant up, we could see some serious change happen. And the little just mentions that I've given are like signs that the giant is waking up. It's stretching, it's pulling back the bedclothes, it's kind of beginning to wake up, it's getting out of bed, but we need so much more. This needs to be a central part of our agenda as Christians and as churches. And my prayer is that through saying yes to life, that saying yes to life might play a small part in seeing that happen. The exciting thing in this country is that the Church of England's Lent campaign, its 40 days of reflection and children's resources, have linked up with the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book. Who knew that might not always be the case? So they've brought the two together, and the daily Lent reflections, which you can get in a little booklet, Live Lent is the campaign, caring for God's earth. The daily reflections have been taken from this book. So now across England, we can see churches get engaged, and there's a youth resource for this as well. And my prayer is that this might play a small part over Lent and beyond in waking up the giant of the sleeping church. Thank you. What is my imagined perfect life? In terms of me personally, yeah, it would be, so I see life in terms of relationships. When I look at the biblical story, the narrative that runs right the way through the Bible, I see that we were created to be in relationship with God, with each other, and with the wider natural world. And then as those relationships are in place, then also within ourselves, our own sense of well-being. And as an aside, I think the biblical story is the story in Genesis 3 of those relationships going awry, and then the Israelite people working to put them back to rights, but ultimately Jesus comes in order to restore those relationships. And for me, the good life, a life lived well, both for myself and more widely, would be a life that has those relationships at its heart, with God, with other people, and with the wider natural world. And then peace with self comes as a result of that. And I could look much more practically at what that might actually look like, but that might come out through other questions as well. Yeah, thank you. And that is the role of the church in advocacy and in campaigning. So not just looking at their own practices, whether of the church or the individual congregation, but also using their voice as church and as individuals in order to be calling on governments and also businesses to be putting into place good policies that bring those things about. As you talk about recycling, just one church that comes to mind in Chichester, which is where I'm from, there's an Anglican church there that has set up recycling facilities, but they worked with the local authority to look at what things doesn't the local authority currently recycle, and so they found ways of recycling those and have got bins for those things that you can't put into your curbside recycling, which is a great example and really creative. Yes, yeah, I encounter it a lot and would say that is a bit of the hangover of that heritage from Greek dualism that says this world is inferior and it's going to be destroyed and so on, and also some misreading of some biblical passages like in Peter. Chapter 4 on the creation of the sun, moon and stars, I really wanted to tackle that because I know it's so important. Not just here, but this book is going to be read all around the world, and in other churches in other countries this is a particular issue. So quite a lot of the kind of the passages that relate to that sort of question use imagery around the stars and the moon turning red and what have you. So if you want to look in more detail at what I'm able to say now, chapter 4 is a much deeper exploration of that. But it does come down to a misreading of some of the passages, particularly 2 Peter 3 verse 10, and a misunderstanding of what's meant by new heavens and new earth. So the word used for new doesn't have to mean something new as in different. So if I get a new car, I get rid of one car. I've got to remember I have to stay here. I usually walk up and down and I haven't been able to today. So a new car means I've got rid of one car and I've now got a new one. But it can also mean new in a different way. So I can remember one time when my eldest daughter came downstairs very proudly wearing a t-shirt that she'd adapted. She'd kind of cut some things out, made some tassels, done a whole load of stuff. And she came downstairs and said to me, "Mum, look, do you like my new top?" And that's the kind of new that is being referred to in the scriptural passages around new heavens and new earth. It's transformed, it's renewed. It was her old top, but actually it was very different. And you might not have, you could have recognised some bits, but not all bits. Obviously, a t-shirt is a completely imperfect analogy, but there's that sense of transformation, not of destruction and going to live the rest of our days up in some floaty heaven. And I sometimes think we forget that it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, and people tend only to focus on the earth, there being a new earth. And so I think, well, what about heaven? What does it mean for there to be a new heaven? But it's about renewal and transformation. Just to finish, sorry, I know I'm answering this, taking a long time. I would also say that ultimately we don't know what's going to happen at the end, and whatever view we hold, we need to hold that with humility because we don't know. But whatever happens in the future, that doesn't take away from the fact that there's so much else in the scriptures that teaches us to take care of this world, to take care of God's creation, both humans and wider. So whatever view you hold shouldn't stop you from taking care of the present, because there's still plenty of other stuff there that tells us we should be doing that. Yeah, thank you. We need to hold our government to the commitments that it made at the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015. and push them to go further, but at the very least we need to hold them to keep to that. So I would really encourage you to get involved in campaigning that is available, whether that's looking at what Christian Aid are doing, or CAFOD, or Tear Fund. Get involved in some organisations and use your voice to push the government. We have this key year this year with the Glasgow COP, the big climate change meetings coming up at the end of the year. And now is the time for us to be pushing and building momentum, and we can bring about change. So the 2015 Paris Climate Change conference was heralded as a success, and the agreement that came from that was very significant. I met recently with a woman called Christiana Figueras, who was the lead architect of the Paris Agreement, and she was the chief UN person there. And she said to me, this wasn't her talking publicly, she just said to me privately, without the faith groups, there would be no Paris Agreement. She was so clear on that. It was because the faith groups had got behind and built political momentum, and actually crucially had prayed. The pilgrimage to Paris, there were prayers and all sorts happening, that Paris turned out to be the success that it was. So get involved, please. Let's use our voices this year, and also let's pray. And again, Christian Aid, CAFOD, Tear Fund and other organisations are joining together this year to call on us for this year to be a year where we pray for the climate. And you can find that through, go on to any of, the easiest thing would be to Google Tear Fund, Pray for the Climate, and you would find that, and then you can find out more. So a big year this year, but pushing for the Paris Agreement to become reality, and around net zero particularly. So well, I hesitate to say what we're seeing, because you may know much better and be able to talk much more knowledgeably. So I'm not hugely knowledgeable on the US scene, but what I am picking up is that as the national administration isn't proving very forthcoming in these areas, that what we're seeing is a much bigger response, kind of lower down, so to speak. So we're seeing states taking issues into their hand and saying, well, Trump's not going to do this, but we are, and so we're going to push for things at a state level. And I believe there's a mayoral movement as well, of mayors of some of the major cities similarly joining up and saying, we're going to take action in our cities. So I would, depending on where you're from, I would look to see maybe what more localised action there is around you that you can join in on. But also don't stop pushing at a national level too, and keep going with that. And it won't last forever. It may last a little while longer than we're wanting it to, but it won't last forever, and keep pushing. Yeah, population is a big issue. I would say it's the elephant in the room, but actually I don't think it is anymore, because it is widely talked about. And we know the huge numbers. Is it 9 billion by 2050? I've probably got that wrong, because I'm now haven't got that in front of me. Well, I haven't got anything in front of me. But the numbers of billions that we're headed towards, and the big problems that is causing. We need to hold that hand in hand with a couple of things. One, that not everybody consumes at the same level. So I think it's something like one person in the UK consumes the same amount as 16 people from Bangladesh. So when we talk about population, we have to also talk about consumerism and the high levels of consumerism. And also, of course, the link between population and poverty, and in particular, women's rights and women's empowerment. And so in order to tackle population, we need to tackle poverty, and we need to empower women, particularly with education And we know that when those areas are tackled, then population starts to go down or kind of responds as well. And it looks as if the population towards the end of the century will level off. So we're in the middle of a big bulge. I sometimes picture it. We have a snake at home, a python, and if she eats a rat, you can see it moving. Sorry. This is the image in my mind. You can see it, so, the shape moving along the snake's body. And that, in terms of history, that's kind of where we are with population. We're in this population bulge because we have seen an incredible rise out of poverty in recent decades. And so that has produced, then that has enabled many more people to stay alive who would sadly in previous decades have died. So many more people have stayed alive, but the impact of coming out of poverty is a generational thing. So it hasn't quite impacted in terms of the numbers of children being born. I hope I'm explaining that properly. So across the world, we are seeing that decrease, but that bulge is kind of working its way through the decades. I hope that makes sense. So it will level off, but it's going to level off at an extremely high level. And there are big questions, of course, as to whether we can feed and house and water and provide land for that number of people. And one of the ways by which we will do that is by us in the more developed countries changing our diet, consuming less, reducing our emissions, doing all of those basic things. So, pardon? And not eating pigs, yes, or not very often, but yes, not eating meat basically. So population is caught up in a whole range of other things as well. Yeah, gosh, it's such a massive thing, and there is no doubt that we are in the situation we are in because of our highly capitalist, highly consumer-based culture and an economic system that relies on growth and that puts growth above everything else, puts growth above human well-being and the well-being of the planet. That's not to say that I'm necessarily against capitalism or against consumerism. The problem that we have is the high level that we're operating at today, which then pushes us beyond our planetary limits, our planetary boundaries. It sounds like the kind of terms you're using sounds like you've read a bit around this anyway. So there's all sorts of good places to go to look into it more. There's Kate Raworth and her Donut Economics. Kate Raworth, Donut Economics. I'd also point you to work that we've done at Tear Fund around something called the restorative economy. And again, you could just put that into your search engine, Tear Fund Restorative Economy, and you'll find out more there. Yeah, it's not something I'm involved with personally, though I have friends in some of the big companies that are involved with that. All of these moves are very welcome, and companies are knowing that businesses are knowing that they need to shift. It links in with this other question. All the time we are operating within a big system that is focused on growth and is based around shareholder value and anonymous shareholders who don't actually have a sense of personal responsibility for those businesses. That's only going to take us so far, and it's very welcome, so I'm not decrying it, and we really need companies to be making significant shifts, but I question how much of a shift we will see all the time we're in this particular system that we're in. But there are good examples. You know, Unilever has been making big strides. That's one example of a company that's really trying to do its best within the system that it's in.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Let's show our appreciation to you. Thank you very much indeed for such an interesting Sunday forum, for the time that you've spent with us here today and for answering the questions, but especially for your book. And we do pray here at St Paul's Cathedral that it will be read widely, and not just in this country but across the world, and will have an effect on those who read it. So thank you very much indeed. Well, it is the end now of the Sunday Forum. Our next forum is on the 1st of March, when Mark Barrett, a monk of the Benedictine community of Worth Abbey in Sussex, will help us to understand the Psalms as a gateway to prayer. Our next evening event takes place on the 24th of March, it's a Tuesday, when John Barton, one of the great biblical scholars, will explore our understanding of the Bible and how it came to be formed, so compiled and then interpreted. Details of all these forthcoming events are available on the leaflets which you have in front of you, also on the website, and please do distribute those to friends or to your church communities. We do hope that you'll join us again. Thank you for coming today. Thank you.